Mutants have existed in the world for quite some time, but few know that their history goes back billions of years. Yep, that's right, this is gonna be an information-heavy video, so I wouldn't want to spend a lot of time on the intro. But rest assured, after watching this, your mutant game will be much stronger than ever. So without further ado, let's begin. Before we get into our explanation, we have a very small request. If you like our content, please support us by subscribing to our channel. This is a small click for you, but for us it means a lot. Thank you. Let's begin. Extraterrestrial or alien mutants. So yeah, before I talk about mutants on Earth and how they evolved billions of years ago and the role of beings like the Celestials, and more specifically the progenitor, I think I should talk a little bit about the mutants who existed out of Earth. I'm sure you understand that mutation in the Marvel Universe is just a biological phenomenon and nothing more. Yes, there have been plenty of different explanations behind it, but at the end of the day, a mutant results from a bit of physiological tweaking. Naturally, we have mutants beyond Earth as well, and probably the oldest such mutants being called better known as the Obliterator. This guy existed around 5.5 billion years ago and was obsessed with killing his own race after he found out that he was immortal. Once the monomaniac was done with annihilating his race, he moved on to hunting other species and eventually became an elder of his universe. He was eventually abandoned on a planet with no living fauna to kill, and that's how the obliteration of the Obliterator came to be. Next in line has to be Chalk, from a billion years ago. This guy belonged to a race of bird-like humanoids from Mars. Because of his mutation, he turned out to be beakless and looked nearly human. Another alien mutant was Gaia, the former guardian of the universe Amalgamator, who was born at least 17,000 years ago. Of course, there have been many more alien mutants, but discussing all of them would not quite serve the purpose of the video. So we'll move on to the history of mutations and the mutants of Earth. Threshold. A 2 billion year old mutant tribe. Now, according to the latest story arcs, more specifically, Volume 2 of the Marauders comics from 2022, we will learn about a 2 billion year old community of mutants from the Proterozoic era. In Marauders number 4, by Steve Orlando, Eleonora Carlini, Matt Milla, and Ariana Mayer, the titular team uncovers a big secret from the Shi'ar's kin Crimson. They learn about an ancient mutant civilization called Threshold. This civilization was powerful enough to hand the young Shi'ar Empire its first defeat. In the subsequent issues of Marauders Volume 2, Psylocke and Cassandra Nova, Professor X's evil twin sister, and Deadpool and Wolverine's primary villain, plan to bring back the Threshold to ensure the safety of mutantkind. They learn that when the Shi'ar ancestors tried to plunder this civilization, Threshold's mutants drove them away. Humiliated, the Shi'ar evolved and launched a full-scale war against Threshold, but were defeated again by Threshold's 5 strongest mutants. Threshold's mutants appear far more powerful than their modern descendants. The ancient Shi'ar, though less advanced than today's empire, was still much more advanced than Threshold. Yet they lost. Even the Obliterator. Yep, the same elder of the universe that I was talking about earlier. Yeah, so he was hired for the second invasion and was easily defeated by the Threshold 5. However, even these powerful mutants could not stand the test of time and perished, which is why the Marauders plan to go back in time to bring the Thresholders back using the Seed, which is basically a box containing the genetic material of those mutants who perished in the Genoshan massacre. 1 million years ago. Before the first host, 1 million years ago, the Stone Age Avengers prepared for the return of the Celestials. Agamotto mentioned as a mutant on their roster. This mutant was Phoenix, born with telepathy and telekinesis, attracting the Phoenix Force to her. She was part of the Tribe Without Fear, a group of mutants rescued by the Highwalker. They saved unwanted children left to die on the burnt place. The tribe met its end when the Neanderthals tried to exterminate them. Both groups fought and killed each other, leaving Firehair as the sole survivor. First host. During their first host on Earth 1 million years ago, the Celestials gathered a tribe called the Wanderers. You could say these guys were Homo erectus, or the species that links humans and apes, and these guys would go on to become Homo sapiens later on. Gamenon, the Gatherer, collected these ape men and sent them to Ziran the Tester, who mutated their genomes to create the unstable and varied deviants, known as Homo descendus. These deviants hid in caves after their release. Another Celestial, Nezar the Calculator, then created the Eternals, or Homo immortalis, who were tall, hairless beings capable of harnessing cosmic power, and flew out of the celestial ship. Oneg, the Prober, introduced a latent gene that expanded human potential. This gene was dormant in Homo erectus, but laid the groundwork for superhuman abilities. This potential passed through Homo antecessor to Homo neanderthalensis, both experimented on by the Kree to create the Inhumans, or in Homo supremus. An early Inhuman named Tuck lived among humans and passed on his unique genetic code, which increased humanity's potential for mutation. This eventually led to the emergence of Homo superior, the mutants with what Marvel calls the X gene. Needless to say, mutants have been around for millennia, often explained in the context of magic or folklore. During the arrival of man, Phoenix was one of these early mutants. During the Stone Age, she hosted the Phoenix Force and was part of the Avengers. But if we want to go chronologically, there have been several other individuals who are noted as among the first mutants. Now, you have to remember that the reason why we have so many people being called the first mutants is that Marvel Comics are not penned by one writer. Writers pick up a story and give it their own spin. Sometimes they maintain continuity, and at other times, they don't care. Sometimes, writers say something about a character, and the next guy doesn't follow up on it. So, we have many mutants claiming that they are the first mutants. There's a huge lack of collaborative elements. Hence, we have a lot of first mutants. So let's explore these. Selene Gallio, known from Earth 616, could be one of the first mutants, who was from the early days of human life. The Forever Man is possibly one of the earliest mutants, according to Iron Man. He claims to have lived through 10,000 lives, but this could be an exaggeration. I mean, if each life was 80 years, he's like 80,000 years old. Hungry might be the ultimate primal mutant, or even a demonic entity that existed long before humans. Garbha Xian, even by the standards of the Eternals, is ancient. He claims to have been old when the continents were still shifting. Amal Farouk, the host of the Shadow King, says he's been around since the dawn of humanity, though this likely refers to the Shadow King rather than himself. Amal was born in the 16th century. If you must know, Shadow King is a multiversal entity that takes over its host and does all kinds of nasty things. In fact, Shadow King was partly the reason why Professor X even thought of creating something like the X-Men. Although the Shadow King has never been depicted in live action, this guy has all the trademarks of being a super formidable and deadly X-Men villain, and should be brought to life at the soonest. Lastly, Nicodemus is claimed to be as old as the Swiss mountains, which, if true, could make him the oldest living mutant, considering the first mutants appeared over 1,000,000 years ago. 17,000 years ago in the Hyborian Age. In the Hyborian Age, the first clearly dated human mutant was Selene. She was born in Central Europe 17,000 years ago, after the oceans swallowed Atlantis, and before the rise of the son of Arius. She even fought Kulan Gath over 10,000 years ago. Krul's exact origin is unknown, but he likely came from the northern regions of what became Africa. He had a centuries-old animosity towards Gideon. Krul also invoked Ishtar and Mitra, deities primarily worshipped in the Hyborian Age. Before the birth of Christianity, for a long time, people thought there were only a few mutants in the early days of humanity. However, in 2003, a discovery on Isla de Demonas changed that view. Scientists found a mutant civilization there that was around 15,000 years old, predating the Neolithic Revolution, and far older than the Mayan, Aztec, or Moche civilizations, and even the Egyptian empires. These mutants were part of a group called Naaim. One of them, Azazel, claimed he was Satan and enslaved humanity. Eventually, the Naaim were banished to another dimension by the Chayarathim, mutants known as angels. Yggdrasil was another Naaim trapped in this other dimension. Interestingly, the Banchiwich family, a Jewish lineage, reportedly had firstborn sons who developed powers at puberty for thousands of years. Sabanur, often claimed to be the first mutant, was born 5,000 years ago in Egypt during the First Dynasty, in the 30th century BC. His name means the first one, though Selene predates him by at least 12,000 years. Apocalypse believed he caused the Bronze Age to collapse around 1200 BC. He was mistakenly thought to be the common ancestor of mutants. Many of his descendants, the clan Akaba, held positions of power in Egypt, showcasing their abilities. Okara. Apocalypse was actually part of the second generation of mutants. He lived on the mutant island of Okara. There, he married Genesis, and they had 4 children. Okara was a thriving mutant society until the demonic hordes of Amenth invaded. The Twilight Sword split the island in 2 halves. Apocalypse and the other mutants fought to defend Okara and Earth. When defeat seemed certain, they decided to steal off the demon-infested half, Arako, along with its mutants. These mutants continued to fight the demons while Apocalypse prepared Earth's defenses. Arako and its mutants were sealed in Amenth, while Apocalypse and the other half, Krakoa, remained behind. The 1,000-year period between 4th century BC and AD. In the 4th century BC, twin mutants attempted to cross the English Channel but drowned on their raft. Apocalypse witnessed this event but did not intervene, as their deaths were by their own means. In the 3rd century, Decimus Furius activated his powers in Rome in 281. As a young boy or adolescent, he rampaged through civilians, spent years in prison, and became a gladiator. Worshipped as the Minotaur, he was eventually collected by Apocalypse and stored for later use as War in his final horseman. In the 4th century, Sanjar Javid was active in Persia in the year 325. Apocalypse collected him as well and stored him for later use as Death in his final horseman. There was also speculation by Nova Roman Lucius Aquila that the gods might have been mutants. The Middle Ages. In 1013, Apocalypse went to Scandinavia to kill Thor on the advice of Rama-Tut. He sent his 4 horsemen to kill Folkburn Logan, an ancestor of Wolverine. However, Thor destroyed them. In the early 11th century, externals Garb-Hasien, Nicodemus, and possibly Cruel formed the High Lords. Kandra was active during this time. Around the 12th century, Garb-Hasien discovered the celestial ship in the Holoshan Mountains of northern Mongolia. He met Insabanur in the mid-12th century and claimed to have lived several lifetimes. Nathan Summers, as the Traveler, traveled through time to fight Insabanur, unifying tribes against him. The Scorn, possibly an alien or demonic race, terrorized Macedonia. Powerful mutants, including Insabanur and Garb-Hasien, created the 5 Fingers of Annihilation blade to destroy the Scorn. Mutant priestess Dernarda sacrificed herself to activate the blade, stopping the Scorn. During the Third Crusade, Benet du Paris met mutant Sahrid and the Scarab in Aqaba before manifesting his own powers. Apocalypse offered him to become his servant and renamed him Exodus, locking him away for centuries. In the 14th century, David ap Andras, born in 1337, was an early mutant known as Killcrop. Killcrop, characterized by the early appearance of powers, were thought to be Satan's hellspawn and recognized for their powers and knowledge. Proto-mutants, an early form of mutants with less evolved X genes, lived in Crimea around 600 to 700 years ago. Gabriel Shepherd was stated to be 700 years old, and Ister was around 665 years old. A cosmic being's primal scream, disguised as the Black Plague, annihilated half of Europe's population. Proto-mutants were immune but targeted and eventually killed by humans. They were buried in a mass grave near Kurik, Kazakhstan. Until the 18th century, there were several mutants that came up during this period, more sporadic, and many of these constitute the lesser-known mutants in the history of Marvel, and those who are significant will be found later on, so I'm not divulging into a lot of those mutants here. Let's move on to the time when the global population saw a boom, and so did the mutant population. The Homo superiors started appearing in more numbers than ever, and humanity finally took note of what was going on. The 19th century. In the 19th century, mutants started popping up more frequently. Jonas Graymalkin, activated around 200 years ago. Silas Burr might have been involved in a murder in 1828, although some say he was born at the end of the 19th century. From 1840 to 1870, there was a visible spike in the mutant population. Kabar Brashir, a Clan Akaba member, was born in the 1850s. Tobias Messenger was born in 1859 and activated around 1878. That same year, Nathaniel Essex presented his work on the Essex factors, but was rejected by the Royal Society of London. Who's Essex? Well, for the uninitiated, he's Mr. Sinister. He then sought out freaks, aka mutants, with the right Essex factor, aka X gene, and met Apocalypse, as well as time-traveling Cyclops and Phoenix. Later, in 1863, Jeb Lee activated in the USA, and was also stored by Apocalypse as the pestilence of his final horseman. Amanda Mueller was apparently born around 1860. From 1870 to 1890, the mutant population dipped, but then it started to grow exponentially. By 1891, the externals, Burke, Saul, Absalom, Nicodemus, and Gideon, had formed the High Lords, though they had existed for centuries. In 1897, many members of Clan Akaba, including Frederick and Hamilton Slade, their mother Margaret Slade, and Jack Starsmore were active mutants, but their numbers dwindled to a handful. That same year, John Howlett Jr. died. Victor Creed was born in the late 19th century, along with his siblings Clara and Saul Cleed, who were adults by 1907. James Howlett, aka Wolverine or Logan, or the Legend, was also born at the end of the 19th century. Some others, like Silas Burr, who might have been involved in murders in 1928, but was also born in Canada toward the end of the 19th century, were around for a while. Elias Bogan was alive for at least a century, and might have inspired the original Hellfire Club in the 1780s. Ogun, believed to be a mutant, was active in the 1910s, but was reportedly alive in the early 17th century. 20th century. When the 20th century came knocking at humanity's door, mutants started appearing more and more. The thing about it, in the 100 years between 1900 and 1999, the human population boomed from over 1 billion to nearly 6 billion. Naturally, the mutant population also increased in the same proportion. Oh, if you're wondering, the mutant population is considered to be about 0.5% of the total population. From 1890 onward, there was a big spike in their numbers. By then, mutants had become a significant offshoot of Homo sapiens. In fact, it's considered that the modern mutant race is just about a century old. Rutherford Princeton III was born around 1902, but his mutant abilities only activated when he was 96. In 1906, in San Francisco, the Hellfire Club, led by Molyneux, assembled a group of psychics to find what they called Overmen. Inspired by Nietzsche and Darwin, Molyneux thought these Overmen were the next step in evolution. When the X Club from the future showed up, Molyneux activated a Sentinel, which basically led to the Great San Francisco Earthquake. Morgan Hardy, also known as the Forever Man, was reborn during a fire caused by the earthquake. Speaking of Forever Man, some believe he's the first mutant. His power is basically getting reborn after each death, and he does that every damn time. Although he's been reduced to obscurity in contemporary stories, he was famous for a while. Dr. Nemesis, also considered one of the first modern mutants, was born on December 1, 1906. In 1907, New York was home to many powered beings called Wonders. Among them was Clara Prast, a mutant. Some of the Seers and Wonders might have been mutants, but it's unclear. Silver Fox was active in the 1910s. Around 1910, Tobias Messenger gathered a few other mutants who fought in World War I but died within 10 years. Raven Darkholm was active in the early 20th century, at least by 1921. Jacob Shaw's shapeshifting abilities were activated by Sinister in 1915. Before 1920, Gregory Rasputin, urged by Sinister, was active, posing as a mystic. Irene Adler, born in the 19th century, was active in 1936. Adriana Soria, active during the Second World War, split from mutants and humans to form a new subphylum called Homo insectus. Robert Frank was born around the 1910s to 1920s and was active in 1942. Jacqueline Falsworth, born around the end of World War I, was also active then. Namor, born in 1920, is considered the first of the first mutant boom. Lenore was activated as a young adult in 1947. Namora, or Aquaria Neptuna, was born around 1921. Max Eisenhardt was born in Germany in the 1920s. Meyer Banchowitz was born in Poland in 1924. James Jimmy Jupiter Jankovic and Wolfgang Heinrich were born in 1932. Earth Warren activated at puberty and served in the U.S. Army during the Second World War. Faye Livingstone was active and killed in the 1930s. Amal Farouk was active at least by 1936. In the 1950s, Gene Bittner, Craig Farnsworth, and Ernest Scope, the original members of the Promise, were active mutants. During the Second World War, Meyer Banchowitz was active at 13 during the Nazi invasion of Poland. Jimmy Jupiter was also active during the war. After the Second World War, Simon Lestrin was born in 1945, and Dakin, the son of Wolverine, was born in 1946. The final phase. In the latter half of the 20th century, mutant sightings became way more frequent. Many people think this increase is because of the rise of nuclear technology, which started with the first atomic bomb. They believe radiation caused widespread genetic mutations, but the real reason for the spike remains a mystery. But come on, we're talking about mutants and not the 1998 Godzilla movie. Anyway, contrary to the nuclear reaction theory, the Eternals saw this spike in mutant births as a sign of the coming fourth host. During this time, a young telepath named Charles Xavier met a woman named Moira Kinross. Moira revealed that she was a mutant with the ability to reset her personal timeline upon death. She had lived 9 lives, and had spent most of them fighting for mutant survival. Unfortunately though, all of these lives were in the extermination of mutants. Moira showed Charles the truth, and together they decided to make this lifetime different, which meant they now aimed to ensure the survival of mutantkind. Seeing the oppression of mutants, Xavier created the X-Men, but it was also to defeat evil mutants like the Shadow King, more specifically the hosts of Shadow King. Xavier brought together Bobby Drake, Henry McCoy, Warren Worthington III, Scott Summers, and Jean Grey as his first students. He trained them to control their powers and become superheroes. You know the rest. But of course, Xavier wasn't the only one gathering mutants. Years before forming the X-Men, he met a Holocaust survivor named Max Eisenhardt, who was then using the name Eric Magnus Lenscher, aka Magneto, the master of magnetism. They became friends, but often argued about human-mutant coexistence. Magnus had been scarred by his time in Nazi death camps, and believed humanity would turn against mutants. A fear that was proven true times without number. He thought mutants could only survive by taking their place as the dominant species by force. Xavier and Magnus eventually parted ways. Magnus started calling himself Magneto and recruited mutants who shared his violent ideology, forming the Brotherhood of Mutants. Magneto's Brotherhood frequently clashed with Xavier and his X-Men. The X-Men themselves underwent many changes over the years. Xavier's 5 original students left and rejoined the team on various occasions, joined by an ever-expanding roster of mutants. Over time, the X-Men spanned various breakoff groups, such as X-Factor and X-Force. While Magneto's Brotherhood and Xavier's X-Men were the foremost mutant groups in the 20th century, they weren't the only ones. The mutant terrorists Mystique and Destiny also pursued a radical and violent path to mutant supremacy. Guided by Destiny's precognitive powers, they assumed the mantle of Magneto's Brotherhood after he stopped using the name. They led a team of mutant fighters on a campaign of terrorism and assassination. To avoid imprisonment, the couple reformed the Brotherhood as Freedom Force, a mutant strike force working for the US government. Apocalypse eventually woke up from a long period of dormancy, leading his renewed horsemen back onto the world stage. His harsh and cruel worldview led to conflicts with the X-Men and other mutant groups. groups. In the tunnels beneath New York City, a group of mutants called the Morlocks emerged. These were mutant outcasts, many with powers not suitable for combat or that left them deformed. Banding together, the Morlocks found safety in numbers and isolation, though it didn't last long. The vile Mr. Sinister, obsessed with the mutant genome, even turned himself into a mutant. Sinister learned of the Morlocks and deemed them scientifically useless and a threat to the mutant gene pool. He plotted their extermination and hired a mutant thief named Gambit to recruit a group of mutant mercenaries known as the Marauders. Unaware of their mission, Gambit led them into the tunnels where they began the mutant massacre. All the Morlocks would have died if not for the intervention of the X-Men, X-Factor, and Thor. So that was the history of mutants and mutation from the beginning of the time until the present day. Later events like M-Day and Decimation happened, and Hope Summers was the first mutant to be born after M-Day, but I believe that's a story for another day. Let me know what you think of the video, and if you like our content, don't forget to leave a like and subscribe to us if you haven't already. Have a good one and be safe. Thanks everyone!